Welcome once again to the Talking Archive. I'm Josh Jacobs. Follow us on Instagram at JoshDJ57. That's where I post food reviews every couple days, under 1-minute reviews of different local Los Angeles eateries, even some out-of-town places here and there. And our conversation continues now with Adam Nedeff, the author of a dozen game show books. Now, Adam, you also wrote about Dennis James, and that book you got quite a few interviews for. You got to interview two of Dennis's three sons, Randy and Brad. Yeah. And tell us about how you got to be in contact with them.
They were doing an interview for Stu Shostak's show, which, if you're familiar with Stu, does a wonderful history of television nostalgia show called Stu's Show. And he had Brad and Randy as guests. And so I just wanted to come in and be able to meet the kids of this famous game show host. And it's funny, the first time you see Brad and Randy, the first thing that enters your head is, wow, these two boys were not adopted, because they are dead ringers for their dad. So they walk into the room and you see them and you're just immediately charmed by the sight of them. But Stu brought up the idea of maybe me writing a book about Dennis. And to be honest, it hadn't crossed my mind at that point. But then I thought to myself, okay, if you're talking about somebody who is unsung in the history of television, here's Dennis James, who was the first game show host, the first parade commentator, the first wrestling announcer, the first person to host an infomercial, the first person. Dennis James's whole thing was, since nobody else wanted to get in on the ground floor of early television, he was the one who signed up to do the first everything. He was the one who was willing to say, I'll take a chance and do this. So the first person to do blank, 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 when you're going through the early days of television, very often it's Dennis James, because he was the one guy that was willing to say, yeah, I'll try that. So Dennis did a lot of this extraordinary early work in television and hosted a lot of game shows. And he's one of those unfortunate folks. There are a few game show hosts that are like that. We're talking about this era of professional game show hosts where they went back to the same well and called in the same people to host all the game shows over and over again. And Dennis hosted a lot of game shows, but he's one of those legendary classic era TV hosts who has the bad fortune of the reruns of his stuff have fallen through the cracks. And it's just worked out that his stuff does not get picked up for reruns. And so I wanted to make sure that his name got out there and, like I said, gave him his flowers, to abuse a cliche. But he was a guy that had earned that kind of recognition, and I wanted to give it to him.
Yeah, in fact, he was the first choice of Mark Goodson to host the new Price is Right in the 1970s. But Brad confirmed this to me, that CBS thought he was too associated with NBC, and so they chose Bob Barker.
That was the weirdest thing, yeah.
Even though Bob Barker was associated with NBC.
Yeah, they didn't want an NBC star on CBS, which is so strange to me, especially because Dennis had such a long career. Dennis was a star on every network, so I don't see how you make him an NBC star, but that was CBS's attitude, so they wanted another host for it. And that's what leads to Bob Barker becoming the host, and Bob really was the third choice. Bill Cullen was the first one asked because he had hosted the original Price is Right.
That's right, yeah.
And Bill had asked for a substantial amount of money to host the new version of the Price is Right. What gets out very often is that Bill said no because of his mobility issues. It had nothing to do with his mobility issues. It was, he asked for a big payday to host the show, and Mark Goodson and Bill Todman said no. So they went to Dennis James, and then CBS said somebody besides Dennis James. So it's very funny, this legendary show as we know it with Bob Barker, Bob hosting it for 35 years. And it was pretty much by accident. He was the next host on the list after people said no.
And he didn't even want to host the show. Yeah. He wanted to do either Joker's Wild or Gambit, but then Bud Grant said, no, Barker, you will host Price is Right.
I guess the story was he didn't think he would get along with Mark Goodson. But that's, as I've had it explained to me, I don't know that for sure. But, Bob, for whatever reason, thought he wouldn't get along with Goodson. And so he was trying to get in on one of the other game shows, and they said, no, you're going to do Price. And it's easy to see why, because Price, of the three shows that CBS introduced September 4th, 1972, Gambit, The Joker's Wild, Price is Right, The Price is Right is closest to Bob's skill set.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's people from the audience being thrust into a game that they didn't know they were going to play. And that was what Bob did for 15 years of Truth or Consequences. So you want him on The Price is Right. You don't want him on Joker's Wild or Gambit.
I mean, can you imagine Bob Barker going Joker, Joker, Joker?
Yeah.
I mean, you just can't.
I don't see Bob as a straight Q&A guy. I mean, granted, you don't know what these hosts would have done if their shows hadn't worked out so well. So it's easy to say, I can't see Bob doing this when he hosted essentially 2 shows that both happened to stay on the air forever. There's no telling what else Bob could have done. And maybe he would have been great at Joker's Wild. Maybe he would have been great at Gambit. But we'll never know that because he hosted 2 shows that just stayed on the air forever and ever and ever.
In fact, you mentioned that the original choice for Gambit was Jed Allen, the host of Celebrity Bowling.
Yeah. Jed Allen, and he's also a pretty renowned soap opera star. And Jed Allen was hired to host Gambit. And Art Alisi, who was the producer for He Do Quigley Productions, which oversaw Gambit, he said, I don't know what happened, but after we hired Jed Allen, he showed up with a chip on his shoulder. And he said, we don't know where the attitude problem came from, but we just immediately said, okay, we've got to find another host. The interesting thing was, at the time, they were considering Dick Clark because Dick Clark's agent was calling pretty much every game show producer in town and saying, Dick's looking for a game show to host. Do you have anything? So they were considering Dick Clark for Gambit, but it ended up being Wink Martindale who got the job.
Wow. That would have been interesting, seeing Dick Clark. Well, I could maybe see him doing that, you know. A little bit. Obviously, the style would have been different than. But Pyramid was Dick Clark's wheelhouse. I mean, he was just perfect for that show.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember actually. Bill Cohn was the first person I remember hosting Pyramid because when I was about 4 years old, my friend Vanessa, who was about 3.5, called me on the phone one night and said, "Are you going to be watching $25,000 Pyramid at 6:30 on Channel 11?" I said, "Yeah." Now I was thinking I was going to have a little bit of like a kid date with her and watch it together. She never came over, but I did watch the show, and after that, watched it every week until it got canceled. And then I discovered the daytime with Dick Clark a couple months later.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, this is pretty cool. You got a different host at daytime and nighttime, but the same set. kind of like The Price is Right. Dennis James nighttime, Bob Barker morning.
So a girl stood you up and you became a game show fan.
Exactly.
Isn't that the story for all of us who do this?
Exactly. But I'd take the game show. At least over that person.
Yeah.
But actually, that person's husband is one of the producers of The Bachelor.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Don't take it personally, but she made the right call.
Yeah.
Exactly. In the car industry, we call that trading up, Josh. I don't let it.
She sure did. Now I'm forgetting what I was going to ask next. Doggone it. You mentioned in Dennis James's book the episode where he filled in for Bob Barker for several episodes, and unfortunately Bob never mentioned him. But one thing I just found out online a couple months ago, I don't know if you saw the episode, but Bob Dudd, I think it was a 1976 episode of Price is Right. There was a contestant on the show, and she says, "Yeah, I watched the nighttime Price is Right," and then she plays the clock game and wins both prizes. And at the end, Bob says, "Well, Dennis has taught you very well."
Oh, nice.
Which I thought was really cool.
Good. So some acknowledgement there.
Yeah, some acknowledgement.
Good.
So I just want to let you know about that. Unfortunately, came too late for the book, right?
Oh, well, yeah.
But, and then the Monty Hall book was interesting because it was Monty's own autobiography, but you updated it.
That was Bob Bowden, who has been an extraordinary figure in game shows for the last 40 years or so, working behind the scenes as a network executive and as a producer of game shows. And Bob has gotten to know the Hall family pretty well and brought me along as a guest to Monty Hall's funeral and introduced me to the family there. And so Bob suggested that I write an updated Monty Hall biography since Monty had written his autobiography in 1973. And very early on, it became clear that I'm going to be cribbing so much information from this first biography, because this is covering the first 55 years of the man's life, that I realized, it makes more sense to just get my hands on that book. And I mean, get my hands on it in terms of legally. And happily, Monty and his co-author had the foresight to keep the copyright for themselves, which meant I didn't need permission from the publisher. I needed permission from their families. And the Hall family and Bill Libby's family were very, very enthusiastic and very, very eager about signing up and saying, yes, go ahead and do this. So I took Monty's original biography and just started doing my own original research and started started doing my own interviews and just built a new book around the original biography. So it's technically a re-release of Monty's biography, but about 60% new material in it.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
And you said the original book. Now, the original book was about 300 pages long.
The original book was 300 pages, and Monty considered it a disappointment because he called it the Reader's Digest version of my life. The manuscript that he and Bill Libby had originally delivered to the publisher was 800 pages. And unfortunately, that manuscript is lost to history. We don't know what those 800 pages looked like. But Monty considered his autobiography a disappointment when it was initially published because it had been whittled down all the way to 300 pages. So I was happy to try to fix that by making as thorough and comprehensive and exhaustive a life story as I possibly could.
And because by the time you had written it, Monty and his wife Marilyn were both gone. She passed away a couple months before he did.
Yeah.
So you got to interview two of his three children. And what were some stories that they shared? I guess anything that was interesting that you thought, I never knew this about Monty ever before. And you also got to meet his brother Robert, was it?
Yeah, his brother Robert in Toronto. Got a chance to talk to him by phone. I didn't get a chance to meet him, but when I interviewed his children, what I was curious about was Monty had grown up in a destitute household, and to go from the proverbial rags to riches, I was curious to know what's it like to have to grow up in a house where you have everything, but your father knew life with nothing. How did that show itself? And his children's memories were, don't you dare leave a light turned on when you leave a room, because he was always so aware of the electric bill. Or he would complain about the fact that they hired a gardener, and the reason they had a gardener was because it's Beverly Hills. Every house has a massive yard. You need a gardener. So he would complain about having to pay the gardener. So he had all these little complaints about money during his adult life, and what it boiled down to was, because he had lived in a home where the electricity was shut off over and over again, Monty really thought of money in terms of what could be done with it. And so he really worried and he really fretted about money. He stayed home a lot. He and his wife stayed home a lot more often and preferred to just cook instead of going out to dinner. Even though they could afford to go to a nice restaurant, they very strongly preferred to stay home, and that came partly from Monty being aware of what a dollar cost and wanting to hold on to that money because of those childhood memories of, the money going away. So it was interesting learning about that mindset and learning about, and even then Monty would complain when his wife made too much food. He would say, well, you made too much of this. This is going to go to waste, because again, that was childhood memories coming to the surface. Every scrap of food counts. Every scrap of food has to be accounted for. Oh my God, what if we have to throw something away because it rots? So just that childhood trauma, that childhood memory of a household that didn't have very much, just always lingered with him. No matter how much he had, he could never purge those kinds of memories. And Richard said, there's every possibility that I'm reading too much into this, but he had, Monty had just a miserable job when he was a teenager as a delivery boy on a bicycle. And it gets pretty cold in Winnipeg, Canada during the winters. And so just being on a bicycle in the middle of winter and having to do it because you're having to provide some kind of money for your family, that's a difficult way to go through life. And Richard said, it always stuck out to me that Dad never rode a bicycle once he was an adult. He's basically, and I think what Richard's reading into is there's a possibility that having to be on that bicycle was such a negative memory for Monty that the moment he was financially comfortable, never went anywhere near a bicycle again because he just didn't want to think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because his dad, Morris Halpern was his real name, owned a slaughterhouse. So Monty grew up in a very working class family up in Winnipeg. And I got invited to his house probably about 9 years ago now to talk about Jack Barry. And when I got there, I was rolling tape on my little recorder on my phone, and he talked probably about 5 minutes about working for Jack Barry. But then he talked for another 50 minutes. It's like, you know what? I'm going to keep this thing rolling. I'm talking with Monty Hall for crying out loud. And, I think the saddest part was when he talked about Jay Stewart.
Yeah.
And, he was he was crying. And I didn't know what to say. I was just like, my jaw dropped.
Yeah.
But, just because Jay had asked him for work, but he says, I'm sorry, Jay, I wished I could give you something, but I'm not producing anything right now.
Yeah.
I just can't help out, unfortunately.
No.
I know that Jay became an agent. In fact, Ed McKay, the announcer of the Joker's Wild 1990, Jay Stewart was Ed's agent for a while.
Yeah. A friend of Bob Bowden, again, Bob was working at ABC in 1989. And the day after Jay Stewart committed suicide, Bob got a letter intended for him from Jay Stewart. And it was a letter asking Bob for an office job. And Bob said it was the most disheartening thing because this is a 71-year-old announcer. And he's looking for, what am I going to hire him for? A file clerk or something like that? Jay became an agent or attempted to become an agent, and it didn't work out because so many people assumed that he was looking for work for himself. They couldn't grasp that he was looking for work for clients. And unfortunately, Jay had some personal issues that had sort of burned some bridges in his own career as an announcer, which led to him being fired from the Sale of the Century.
Yeah, I was wondering what happened to him because I remember, I think the last season, Don Morrow had taken over as the announcer.
Yeah, Don Morrow took over. To my understanding, the issue that they had with Jay was because Jay had so many issues going on, they found that it was easier to have him pre-record his announcing as much as they possibly could, because that way they could get rid of the mistakes. And Jay, I guess, made a lot of mistakes.
Wow.
But, yeah, everybody spoke to the issues that Jay had, and what Carol Merrill said and what she said she felt it was important to discuss this, even though it's an unpleasant thing to talk about. It's an important thing to talk about. Because she said this is what people don't understand about depression and what people don't understand about mental illness is good things happening don't automatically take that away. Like Jay Stewart was wealthy and successful. Money and success do not automatically mean that everything is okay. And that's certainly the lesson to take away from Jay Stewart is, even if things are going well with a friend, it's still a good idea to check on them and see what's going on in their lives.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of a conversation with game show author Adam Nedeff. He's written over a dozen game show books, including several biographies. By the way, follow him on Facebook. Just go to author Adam Nedeff. That's author Adam Nedeff on Facebook to follow him and get updates. He updates it just about every day, sometimes several times a day. And next time, Adam talks about his interviews he's done for the Strong National Museum of Play for their soon-to-open game show exhibit. Plus, wonderful stories about some Gong Show contestants.